Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf and Gimel contains 3 sugyas, 2 very small ones and 1 very large one. It is also the last daf in the 6th parak Elu Dvarim, and ends it off at the end of the daf. So first of all, we're analyzing our Mishnah. The Mishnah had listed a number of psulim for karbonos and had said that if you do any of these karbonos on Shabbos, because they are puzzle, you violate the Isser Deraisa of shechting, slaughtering an animal on Shabbos. The Gemara wants to know, why do we need to list each of these if we already know what's puzzle and what's not, and it's an obvious rule that if it's puzzle, it's a violation of Shabbos. Then the Gemara asks, why should you be chayav chatas for any of these violations? In order to be chayav chatas, you have to have a tikkun, you have to be fixing something, and then the Gemara will have a lengthy discussion of what happens when you have one carbon trying to change to another type of carbon. Do you have to actually change it, or can it sometimes revert automatically? So our first discussion is, the Mishnah had listed a number of different types of psulim. The Gemara wants to know, why do you have to list each of them? So the Gemara first of all talks about the psul of a carbon Pesach, where all the people that are named in it are not able to eat from it. The Gemara says, of course that's a psul. We already learned that that's a psul, so then it's obviously an Issa Deraisa to do that on Shabbos. The Gemara says that's not a chiddush. The chiddush is that if some of the people are kosher, then it's not an Issa Deraisa. The Gemara says, what do you mean? That's a kosher carbon, so that's for sure not an Issa Deraisa. What's a chiddush in that either? Where it says, no, the chiddush is, in a case where you shechted a different carbon as a carbon in Pesach, that's puzzle and that is an Esser Shabbos. And Gemara says, that's also not a chiddush. That also says. Gemara says, well, we wanted to mention it here in this Mishnah because here we introduce a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, if there's a chi of chatas in that or not, or if we can call it a tayyib b'dvar mitzvah. We could say that somebody made a mistake, he got confused while he was trying to do a mitzvah, and you don't have to bring a carbon chatas for that. Okay. Gemara goes on to its next sugya, which is, all these things here we said that you have a carbon chatas for them, you only have to bring a carbon chatas if you did a tikkun on Shabbos. You do an Issa Deraisa on Shabbos, it doesn't fix anything, it just ruins something. There's no Issa Deraisa on that. It's got to be fixing something to be an Isser. So Gemara says, what is the fixing in each of these these puzzle carbonas that you shechted? You didn't fix anything, you just destroyed the animal. And you haven't created any function, so what's the point of it? What is the tikkun? Now the Gemara notes it's a machlokes whether or not you could bring a carbon chatas for an Isser Deraisa that's not a tikkun. The Gemara says, my question is according to the opinion that you can't bring a carbon chatas unless there's a tikkun. What's a tikkun in all these cases? So the Gemara first of all asks about the case of where you shechted the animal, you brought a carbon Pesach, and it was possible because you didn't have anybody who was signed up to it who could eat it. So Gemara says the tikkun is that a psul like that, if you shechted it and you put it up on the mizbech, you don't have to take it off the mizbech. You're not supposed to put it on the mizbech. It is a puzzle carbon, but if you did, it doesn't have to come off. So Gemara says, okay, that helps with that, but what if it's a balmum? We've seen here in our Mishnah that if if you shechted the animal and it's a balmum, it's got a mum, it's a puzzle carbon, you bring the carbon chatas for that. But how are you creating anything useful by shechting a balmum? So Gemara says the chiddush there is, according to Rabbi Akiva, who says there's a certain type of mum that you could leave it on the mizbech if you put it up there already, and that's the mum called dukin sheba'ayin, where there's a type of covering, like cataracts almost that grows over the eye. A mum like that, Rabbi Akiva says you could leave it on the mizbeach if you put it up already, and therefore that's the case that we're referring to, that you would have to bring a carbon chatas. So the Gemara says, but okay, now however, we said in the Mishnah that if the animal is treif, it has disease internally, so if you couldn't find it while it was alive, you don't have to bring a chatas. But if you could have, the implication is, you do have to bring a carbon chatas. But why? You didn't fix anything. That definitely can't go on the mizbeach. Gemara says, you're right, it can't go on the mizbech, but by shechting it, at least you made it not become tamei. Had it died on its own, it would be tamei because it's in avela. At least in this way, it's not tamei. So Gemara says, okay, but what about this brisa? There's a brisa that says that somebody who shechts an animal on Shabbos, which is a carbon, and he brings it as a chatas to an avodah zara. So in that he violated 3 isurei kares. First of all, he was mechal Shabbos. Second of all, he shachted outside the azara. Third of all, he shachted for an avodah zara. Now, since it's for an avodah zara, it is tamei. Avodah zara karbanos are tamei for sure. So here he didn't accomplish anything. Why do we say that he's chayav a karban chatas for shachting on Shabbos? There's no fixing. So Gemara says there is something, at least he's improving it, that it's not going to be Ever Menachai. If it would be Ever Menachai, as long as it was alive, it has an Isser Ever Menachai on it, and if a guy would eat it, he would get Misa for Ever Menachai, unless you've taken off the Isser Ever Menachai. Okay, the Gemara now begins its final sugya for the parak. This will take us till the end of the chapter, and that is, what happens when a carbon reverts to a different type of carbon? Do you have to actively change the designation, or does it happen automatically? Now, how does a carbon revert from one type of carbon to another? So usually that happens when the owner, the one who owns the carbon, has set it aside for a certain type of a carbon, no longer needs that carbon. So, for example, somebody has an obligation to bring a carbon asham. Carbon asham comes from certain types of averas that he did. Then, either the owner dies, or the owner ends up bringing a different carbon for that asham. Maybe he lost the first one, and therefore he brought a second one, and then he finds the first one. But whatever it is, he doesn't need that carbon asham anymore, or he no longer exists. So in a case like that, that asham is supposed to turn into a carbon oila. An asham, now what we brought as an asham, turns into a carbon oila. Now, it's not supposed to be brought itself as a carbon oila. What you're supposed to do is let it graze in the field by itself until it gets a mum, then sell it, take the money, and use that money to buy an animal which is a carbon oila. That's one way in which this animal reverts from an asham to an oila. Now, a carbon pesach does a very similar thing. A carbon pesach that's not used for a carbon pesach, maybe because something happened to the owners, they brought a different one, they lost it, or they withdrew from it, and there was nobody left that's involved in this particular animal, whatever it is, if it's not used as a carbon pesach, it reverts to a shlamim. So here you have two examples. An asham reverts to an oila, a pesach reverts to a shlamim. Now the question is going to be, and here we'll have contradictions between the two sugyas, does it revert automatically? The animal itself changes from being an asham to an oila without having to designate it? The pesach changes from a pesach to a shlamim? Or do you have to actually go and change the designation? And until you do, it stays in its old designation, and if you shecht it in its new version without actually changing actively, you've shechted an animal in its wrong designation. You were supposed to change it before you shechted it, and you didn't, and therefore it would be a psol. So the Gemara begins by discussing a carbon asham that turns into an oila. Now, what you're supposed to do is not shech the asham as an oila. You're supposed to sell it and cash the money in for a different animal, and that will be an oila. Says the Gemara quotes a statement of Rav Huna that says that if you went and you shechted it, it's good. You weren't supposed to, but if you actually took this animal, you shechted it, you could use it as an oila now. The animal itself could become an oila. Now the Gemara says this is obviously referring to where you didn't change the designation, or there's nothing to talk about. So it's an asham. It reverted automatically to an oila. Since you were supposed to sell it and use its money as an oila, if you made it itself into an oila accidentally, it's still good. It's okay. So here we see that you don't have to do an akira. You don't have to change the designation. Now, before we get into conflicting or contrasting this with the carbon pesach, the Gemara wants to analyze this halach itself. Rav Huna had only said that it's okay once it was nitek laraya. That means that this animal, what were you supposed to do with it? You were supposed to give it over to a shepherd, let it graze and be out in the fields until it gets a mum. Now, Rav Huna only said it's only good if you shecht it as a carbon oila once you gave it over to the shepherd. You sent it out. You sent it on its way to become a carbon oila. You sent it on its way to graze and to get a mum so that you could sell it. And then you accidentally, I guess you forgot, and you brought it as a carbon oila. Now, the Gemara tries to understand. Obviously, we're holding you don't have to change the designation because you never changed the designation. The question is, if that's true, why do you have to give it over to the shepherd? Why don't you just say, if I took the animal and I shechted it as an oila, it's good. Why does it have to be that I gave it over to the shepherd? The Gemara says it has to be, because if we let you, if we said it was kosher, if you shechted it as an oila, you would end up getting confused, and you would bring it as an oila even if the original owner is still around. you would take an animal that's an asham and bring it as an ayla, even if you didn't have calling to do that, because there was nothing wrong. The original owner either was still around and still obligated in bringing this carbon. That's puzzle for sure. In order to avoid that confusion, we say the only way that it's kosher, b'di evet, if you shechted it as an ayla, is if you already sent it out to the fields to pasture and get a mum. Then we say you won't get confused between whether the owner is still around or not, because you're never going to send it out to pasture unless the owner already no longer needs it. Otherwise, we would say that you will get confused between the two, between when the owner still needs it and the owner does not need it. Now the Gemara says, how do you know that there's such a difference? So the Gemara quotes a Mishnah as 3 opinions in what you do with an asham that no longer is needed by its owners. First opinion is the Chachamim that says you let it graze until it gets a mum, and then you sell it and you buy a carbon oilas nidava. That means not an oila that you're going to use yourself, but an oila that belongs to the tzibor that will be used generally for everybody. Rashi says that's important halacha because then there's no smicha on the oila. Rabbi Yeshua says what you actually have to do is you can actually sell it and use it for your own carbon oila. If you're obligated to carbon oila, you can use it for your own. You don't have to give it as an adava to the congregation, as a carbon tzibor. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you just have to kill it. You have to let it die on its own. You cannot use it as an oila at all. So, what we see from here is that since all 3 opinions in this Mishnah agree that you're not supposed to use the animal itself as a carbon oila. Again, if you do b'diavad, it's okay, but you're not supposed to use it as a carbon oila. We see that they all agree, at least, that there is a gzeira. We don't want you to use it as an oila because you'll get confused and end up using an animal that the owners are still around. So we have a source for that gzeira, that gzeira exists. Okay, now the Gemara wants to contrast and compare the asham reverting to an oila to the carbon pesach reverting to a carbon shlomim. And as we've seen, the asham reverting to an oila, we said it reverts automatically, and if you bring it as an oila, it's kosher. You don't have to actually change it. So the Gemara is going to prove to you that carbon pesach is not that way, and that'll be a contradiction, and the Gemara is going to try several answers. Where do you see carbon pesach is not that way? So in our Mishnah we had said that if somebody brings a carbon pesach that doesn't have owners anymore, the owners either withdrew from it, or they died, or they became tamei. So it's not his fault. He didn't do anything. He wasn't Mechal Shabbos. He didn't know. But there's another Mishnah that adds to that and says that if it will be during the weekday, then you're supposed to take this carbon pesach and burn it. Meaning it's already been shechted. There isn't anything you can do about that. But it's a puzzle carbon. What do you do with it? So you can burn it right away. Now the halacha is as follows. A carbon that was shechted and has a psol, you're only supposed to burn it if it has a psol in its guf, that it itself is puzzle in and of itself. If something happened to it externally that you can't continue to bring it, and then it's still called kachim. You're not supposed to burn it. You're supposed to leave it overnight till it becomes noisar. It has lina, and it's too late. Then it already has a psol in the guf, and then you could burn it. But you can only burn it right away if it has a psol that's innate and in it. Now here, this brisa says that this carbon, the carbon pesach that its owners withdrew, you could burn it right away. That means that it's puzzle in and of itself. Now, that clearly means that it doesn't become a carbon shlomim automatically. You have to change the designation. That's the only way that it makes sense to say that you could burn it right now. Why? Because if it becomes a carbon shlomim automatically, then when somebody went and he shechted a carbon shlomim. What's the problem? The only problem with it is that he shechted a carbon shlomim after the carbon talmid. You're not supposed to shecht anything after the carbon talmid except for carbon pesach. This guy shechted a carbon shlomim. Okay, that's an outside psol. You should have to leave it overnight and wait till it gets an innate psol before you're allowed to burn it. The fact that we say you're allowed to burn it right now means that it's got to be that it stays as a carbon pesach until you change it. And then this guy went and he brought a carbon pesach that has an innate psol. It has no owners. Carbon pesach with no owners. Now I understand why you could burn it right away. So, what we see from here, bottom line, is that this carbon pesach does not revert automatically. Yet before we said that the carbon ashim does revert automatically to a carbon oila. That is a contradiction, and the Gemara needs to find several answers for this. So the Gemara's first approach is to say that really the correct halacha is that you have to change the designation. We said earlier that about the asham, if you shechted it, you could bring it as an oila, even if you didn't actively change the designation. Change the wording there a little. What you actually say is if you took the asham and you shechted it for an Oila, not that you shechted it regularly, and now you want to bring it as an Oila. You shechted it as an Oila, meaning I changed the designation to an Oila, and then shechted it, that's when it's okay. And really, both by the Asham and by the Pesach, you have to change the designation before you shechted it. The Gemara says that answer is not going to work, because we have another source. It says, even by Korban Pesach, you don't have to change the designation, and that's a statement of Rabbi Chia Bar Gamda, who said that only if the owners became Tmei Mesim do you have to change the designation, but other types of situations you don't. So we have another source, and it clearly shows that you don't have to change the designation. We're going to have to figure out a way to understand why in our Mishnah and in the Brisa that explains it, we're saying that you do have to change the designation. So the Gemara explains as follows. The Gemara says, in this brisa that says that you could burn it right away and it has a psol that's innate, not external, there's a different psol. The problem here is not that it's really a Korban Pesach without owners. No, it reverted to a shlamim. It became a shlamim and it became a shlamim automatically. You don't have to change it actively to a shlamim. The reason that it's puzzle is not because it's a Korban Pesach anymore. The reason that it's puzzle is because this was a Korban Pesach originally, and it was a Korban Pesach, and it had owners after Chatzos. And after Chatzos, the original owner died, and then it became cancelled as a Korban Pesach. Then you want to go back and shech it as a Korban Pesach again. Since it was at a stage where it was after Chatzos with owners, it was locked in as a Korban Pesach right then. It's called Nirin V'nidchin. It was a time when it was actually fully ready. You could have shechted it right then as a Korban Pesach. Once it's in that state, then if you cancel it, you can't shecht it again as a Korban Pesach afterwards. You can't bring it back as a Pesach, and that's why there's a psol. All other cases, we were assuming when a Pesach reverts to shlamim, and you could shecht it again as a Pesach afterwards, and it will be only an external psol. That's if it became reverted to shlamim before Chatzos. There was never a state when it was a Korban Pesach after Chatzos. You could have actually shechted it now. It was designated as a Pesach. It reverted to a shlamim before Chatzos. It was never a time when you could have actually brought it as a Pesach. But this is talking about a situation here where it was actually became ready to be shechted as a Korban Pesach, and then the owner died. That's called Nirin V'nidchin. Once it was fully locked in and qualified, then it gets rejected. You can't bring it back, and that's called an innate psol, and that's why you can't bring it as a Korban Pesach anymore, and it is an innate psol. So Gemara says that there's a problem with that, and that's that the person who this whole sugya is set in is Rav, and Rav holds that a living creature cannot be nidchin, cannot be permanently rejected from certain qualification. Once it's shechted, its blood can be disqualified, or its meat can be disqualified, its amur can be disqualified, but a live animal can't be permanently disqualified in that way. So there's the fact that it was ready to be brought, and it was after Chatzos, doesn't make a permanent disqualification, and therefore this couldn't be the pshat. So Gemara says, okay, I'll tell you a different pshat. The pshat is that this shita is Rabbi Eliezer, and really it is a Korban Shlamim, and it reverted to a Korban Shlamim. But Rabbi Eliezer holds if you bring a Korban Shlamim as a Korban Pesach, it's puzzle. It's innately puzzle. Gemara says if it's Rabbi Eliezer, then if it would be Shabbos, you should have to bring Korban Chatas. How come the Mishnah says you don't have to bring a Korban Chatas? The only explanation for not having to bring Korban Chatas is because there's a Taya B'dvar mitzvah. The guy made a mistake while he was trying to do a mitzvah, but Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold that Taya B'dvar mitzvah is pater from the Chatas. So it can't be Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says you're right. I'll tell you who it is. It is Rav Yosef ben Choinoi. Rav Yosef ben Choinoi holds like Rabbi Eliezer that a Korban Shlamim that's brought as a Korban Pesach is puzzle, and it's innately puzzle, and therefore you could burn it right away. But he holds like Rabbi Yeshua that there is such a thing as Taya B'dvar mitzvah. Therefore, this animal, when it's during the week and you shechted it, it has already reverted to a shlamim automatically by itself. You bring it as a Korban Pesach, it's puzzle because it's the wrong shame, and it's innate psal, and you can burn it right away. Yet, if it's Shabbos, you don't have to bring a chatas because you're a Taya B'dvar mitzvah. Now the Gemara offers another answer. The Gemara wants to say maybe really Rav just disagrees with this Mishnah altogether. He holds of a different Tana. The Tana is Rav Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Breika, who clearly seems to hold that you do not need to do an akira, that it changes automatically. Where do you see that he holds that? Because he says you do have to leave it overnight. That if it becomes puzzle, if you shech this animal as a carbon, this Pesach that has no owners, you shecht it, you do have to leave it overnight. That means that it's not psul in the guf itself. That means that it is a carbon shlamim. And that's why, that would seem to be the explanation, that he says you have to leave it overnight before you could burn it. And so Rav holds like that. Rav holds that that it reverts automatically and it's a shlamim, and like this Tana. And yes, he argues on our Mishnah and our Tana that seems to say that it stays as a carbon Pesach. So Gemara says, not necessarily. Hold on a second. It doesn't necessarily back him up. Because the fact that he holds that you have to leave it overnight before you can burn it is not because he holds that it is really a carbon shlomim and it reverted automatically. The reason why he holds so is because he holds even something which is a psul aguf, even something which is innately puzzle, you still have to leave it overnight. I mean, he doesn't disagree with the other Tana that we've seen. He holds that it did not revert automatically, and it is a carbon pesach, and it is puzzle in its guf itself. Rav can't hide behind him. He says you have to leave it overnight anyway because he holds it. That's true. Even a piggle, something which is innately puzzle, you still have to leave it overnight anyway. And I'll prove to you that that's what he holds because he says the same halacha when the Bailam became Tmei Mesim. When the Bailam became Tmei Mesim, it definitely didn't revert to a shlamim. You could still bring it as a Pesach Sheni. They're going to bring the same carbon as Pesach Sheni. And yet he still says that if you shechted it now, it's got to be left overnight. Obviously, even though it's a carbon Pesach, it didn't revert, and it's still a psul aguf. He still says you have to bring it over anyway. So we're going to reject this answer, and therefore we're going to go with our original answer, that it's Yosef ben Chainoi, that is the author here, and that's who Rav is.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.